Welcome, everyone. My name is Julie Shields-Ratina, and I'm the Director of College Planning, Education, and Training at MEFA. And we're so happy to have you here this afternoon for this very sought-after topic. So I am going to serve as one of your moderators today, and the others will be my colleague, my MEFA colleague, Sean Morrissey, and my Massachusetts colleague, Amy Staffier, who is from Simmons University and also the president of the Massachusetts Financial Aid Association, MASFAA. So I'm going to turn it over to them in one moment, who will also talk about our great speakers, but I'm just going to go through a couple of logistics. What I will tell you is that we have a very, very large crowd here today, which tells us that's great because we have a lot to talk about. But because of that, we're going to try to make it as interactive as possible that you can on a webinar like this with a lot of people. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen if you have a question, or if you just have a comment, if you want to share something, because again, we really want this to be a discussion and hear from all of you, as well as, have you answer your questions if you have some. So we're going to use that as the interaction, and we will be bringing up what we see in that Q&A section to the presenters, both sometimes while they're speaking, and then we're going to leave a lot of time at the end for that discussion. So the other piece I'll just say is if you need closed captioning, you can hit the live transcript button and you will be able to see the words that we're speaking. Finally, we're going to record it, and tomorrow we will send you the recording and a copy of the slides. So with that, Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. I just want to thank our speakers for being here today. I was thinking over the last few days that without my colleagues at MASFAA and NASFAA, I never would have gotten through HERF and all of that, as things were coming together and regulations were changing constantly, sometimes even after we had started dispersing funds, and how everyone in the financial aid industry just pulled together and helped one another out through this. And I was thinking, FAFSA simplification seems huge, but we're getting information sooner than we did with HERF. So it's coming out later than some of us hoped, but we're certainly getting it earlier and are able to do a little bit more preparation. And again, all of our colleagues are there to help one another out. And I'm just very inspired by the people who are on this panel. They're experts in the field and have been working hard to learn this information and to share what they're able to. And we have Gail Holt, the Dean of Financial Aid from Amherst College, who is also the chair of the NASFAA FAFSA Simplification Implementation Working Group. And we have Jill Dejean from NASFAA as well. She is the policy analyst at NASFAA. And I remember Jill back when she was around the MASFAA table on the executive council there. So she does have Massachusetts roots, and we're happy to have you back, Jill. And also we have Amy Staffier from Simmons University, the current MASFAA president.
And Amy, would you like to say hello and welcome from MASFAA too?
I do not want to take any more time, but I fully agree with what Sean has said, and just happy that we could kind of collaborate and have these this webinar.
All right, and I will be on the slides here for you.
Great. Well, I think we're ready to go. So welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see at least the number that represents all of you attending this webinar. And I'm thrilled to be able to do this with our MASFAA colleague, Jill, who is representative of all of the hard work behind NASFAA. I'm excited and proud to be part of the FAFSA Simplification and Implementation Working Group, but none of our work is possible without the fantastic NASFAA staff. And that's represented in so many ways. It's represented, and we'll talk about this today, but through bringing out the SAI modeling tool and the various versions of that tool. And also the case studies. Jill's been behind the case studies, been behind the checklist. So we talk about issues, we bring things out, but there's so much collaboration to bring tools to you, the membership. I'll also shout out one more thing, issues that you care about, student employment, federal work study, and the challenges that we will have in reporting. Jill is also behind the comments and the voice that gives a resounding, you need to hear us and you need to hear about our burden so that we can serve students better. So MASFAA is a great partner and we're glad to have that with us. So what we hope to do today is talk about some of the policy issues that Jill and team have been, researching and addressing and highlighting, as well as starting to talk about how those impact changes in terms of our institutional enrollment goals. We'll talk about some modeling observations, although your home modeling is going to be really critical. What's important to emphasize with FAFSA simplification are there are no right answers, there's no right issues, there's challenges, and we together as a community will help each other think about what applies to us and how our ideas might help our colleagues. There are definitely going to be trade-offs. There's no single right answer. And what's great about this session is really bringing that shared perspective. So your voice, as we get to questions and answers, is critical to continuing this conversation all the way through the fall. So that's what we're looking at. Department of Ed is releasing items regularly, and so there'll be plenty of opportunity to have this discussion. So go ahead, Julie. We'll move forward. So really, this is the right opportunity. Higher ed is been through a very disruptive time with COVID. Families have been looking for a simpler, more straightforward, more transparent way to apply for financial aid for some time. Everybody in my personal life that I speak to, and they say, hey, Gail, what are you doing lately? And I'm proud to share that I'm part of NASFAA's simplification and implementation working group. And I say, they say, well, what's that? And I say, well, the FAFSA is getting simplified and there's big changes ahead. And the first thing that they always say is, thank God, that form is horrible. So I hope that we can ride that wave of optimism that our families, our friends, our colleagues, folks who are maybe not on the back end like we are, but on the front end of that experience will help realize it really to be easier. We will get through this as financial aid administrators. We are like water. We find the path. We make it right. We deal with change in all good ways. We have great people fighting for those things that really do need to change. And as Sean opened up, I mean, HERF was really the perfect scrimmage because we had to do so much that was out of our comfort zone. We had to do so much that was like, wait, this is breaking our thinking. Like, whoever thought we would be doing an annual report based on calendar year? Calendar year? You mean academic year, right? I mean, so it has totally, we've been disrupted and we have learned a lot. So apply those skills to our new mission, which is the biggest change in our profession, certainly in my career and probably others as well. So we'll get through this and we'll get as close to perfect as we can. So here we go. Turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, Sean, both of you for framing this so well. When I think about HERF, I do have a little bit of like PTSD, but one thing I think about as far as dealing with that versus dealing with FAFSA simplification is at least my kids aren't home during online school while I'm trying to deal with all of these changes. So if we got through HERF with 3 kids in the house trying to learn right next to you off camera, we can definitely get through FAFSA simplification. So thank you guys for putting that in perspective. It's true. Financial aid administrators are ridiculously agile and really good at just figuring it out, and we're going to figure it out. So I'm going to get us started just talking about the provisions of the FAFSA Simplification Act themselves. I think you guys have probably heard a lot of it before, but I think it's always worth hearing it again. And I'll talk about some high-level national trends that some modeling has identified, and then Gail's going to delve deeper into that when I'm finished up. So the FAFSA Simplification Act leverages, you can actually go back, Julie, I think I'm still on that slide before.
Okay.
Or no, yeah, I'm good. No, you're right. You're exactly where you should be. Sorry about that. So the FAFSA Simplification Act leverages the Future Act, which was signed into law the year before the FAFSA Simplification Act, which was actually 2019, if you can believe that. And it leverages that ability for the Department of Education to be able to get income data directly from the IRS, which is going to allow them to remove income questions from the FAFSA entirely. And so this direct data exchange, it might not sound like a big ideal because we have the DRT already, but this is really different from the DRT, the data retrieval tool. With the data retrieval tool, families were actually the intermediary between the IRS and the Department of Education. So families went to the IRS website, imported their tax information, and then it was there on the FAFSA for the Department of Education to see. And what the Future Act does is it takes out the middle person. It takes the family out as that intermediary. So the Department of Education is able to query the IRS directly for federal taxpayer information. So it's not just that. It's also that not everyone could use the DRT. That was only available to certain families, certain tax filing statuses, things like that. And of course, we couldn't verify whether someone was a non-filer. And with the Future Act, the people who weren't able to use the DRT will be able to participate in this direct data exchange for the most part. There's still a handful of people who will not be able to use that, but not nearly as many as couldn't use the DRT, and will be able to verify non-filer status, which will be really nice. The other big thing that the FAFSA Simplification Act does, of course, is it makes the application simpler, pulling out those income questions. Those are the hard questions, right? Like everybody knows their birthday. You might have to pull out your social security card to find that, but demographic information isn't so hard. The income questions were hard. They use jargon that people aren't familiar with. Sometimes there's math, like at line, blah, blah, blah from your tax return and subtract line, whatever. People made a lot of mistakes, and it was just intimidating to look at. Like people were discouraged just by looking at the questions, not even taking the time to think through and try to fill it out. And so hopefully it's going to make it something that's more just easily accessible to people who might have been intimidated or heard the scary stories about how hard the FAFSA is to complete. And of course, one downside is that the Department of Education does have to collect consent from each party whose information will be shared from the IRS. So it adds a little bit to the front end complexity, but hopefully overall completing a FAFSA is going to be simpler and take less time. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm actually not ready for that slide. Not on my slide game today, I apologize. So Pell eligibility will also be more transparent as a result of FAFSA simplification and more predictable because it's going to be based primarily on adjusted gross income and family size versus going through the whole FM formula to get an EFC or what will now be called an SAI in the future, which we'll talk about later. Moving forward, if your AGI is below a certain multiplier of the federal poverty guidelines, you get a Pell Grant. That's it. It doesn't matter what your student aid index is or what your EFC in current terminology is. Changes to the FM formula make it more generous for more families overall. So aside from these different ways to calculate Pell Grant eligibility, actual student aid indexes will trend lower than EFCs. And that has to do with a couple of changes to the inputs in the formula themselves. And finally, FAFSA simplification isn't just about the FAFSA. There are lots of miscellaneous provisions that change other aspects of financial aid administration as well. So we'll get into all of that over the next half hour or so. So starting with the form, as I mentioned, applicants won't be presented with income questions anymore on the FAFSA. So depending on what income information flows directly from the IRS behind the scenes, families may also not see any asset questions if their adjusted gross income is less than $60,000, and if they file a simple tax return, or even if they file a little bit of a more complex tax return with a business, but they don't have large gains or losses from that business. For applicants with divorced and separated parents, the rules on whose information to provide in the FAFSA will be changing. So whereas now the who is the parent in a case of divorce or separation is the parent with whom the student lived most, it will change to who provided the student with the most support. And so we know that is the case. We know that's changing. We don't know exactly how in terms of what the time frame might be. We've asked the Department of Education to be clear in their FAFSA instructions to say not just who provided the most support, but to give students a time frame during the most recently completed calendar year, or from July 1 of X to July 1 of Y, or whatever it might be, so that students can accurately answer this question, since just like who did you live with, that can change from year to year, month to month, week to week. Who provided the most support could also vary for students. So we want to make sure that they know how to answer that question. Family size is changing with the FAFSA Simplification Act. So family size will be based on who's claimed as a dependent on your tax return, as opposed to the definition that ED has historically used for the FAFSA. The housing choice question has been eliminated from the FAFSA. Students will be asked where they are planning to attend so that their FAFSA information can go to those schools. But sort of a second piece of that question was, what are your housing plans on campus, off campus, or with family? And that question has been eliminated, as has the option to provide parental data for independent students. And that's not something that a lot of schools worry about, but that was definitely something that was used by graduate schools, where all of their students are independent just by nature of being enrolled in grad school, either for their institutional aid funds, or if they were health profession schools, and if they participated in the Health and Human Service Department's health profession scholarship programs, because those require a need analysis to be done based on parental information to determine eligibility. There are new questions on the FAFSA as well. So some questions have gone away, some questions have been added. In addition to those consent questions that I mentioned before, where the Department of Education has to make sure that everyone whose information goes on the FAFSA actually agrees to have that information pulled in from the IRS. There are new questions as prescribed by Congress on the student's race and sex and ethnicity. And it's important to note here when we're talking about the form that the Department of Ed has pretty much no flexibility anymore on what questions they ask on the FAFSA. So the FAFSA Simplification Act includes a new list of questions that the department may ask on the FAFSA. And it also includes a provision that says, by the way, you can't ask anything else. So in the past, Congress just said, before the HEA was amended for the FAFSA Simplification Act, Congress just said, here's the FM formula. You have to create a FAFSA, go ahead and ask the questions that you need to be able to calculate an EFC. Now Congress says, these are the questions you may ask, and you may not ask any others. So I just wanted to point that out, because we hear a lot from people who say like, oh, especially when people saw the draft FAFSA, which came out about a month ago, why did ED do this? Why did they take away the housing question? Why are they asking these useless questions about demographics and not asking questions I need to determine a student's eligibility? Well, yes, frustrating, without a doubt. Don't blame the department, blame Congress. They're the ones who made the decision. MASFAA has pushed back in some cases. With all that said, there have been areas where we feel like maybe they may have misinterpreted congressional intent, or where they might have some flexibility to sort of ask a question differently. We get how ED sees that their hands are tied, and generally that is true, but where we can push for any kind of changes, we have been doing that. So moving on to the formula, the FAFSA Simplification Act also makes significant changes to the FM formula itself. For one, income protection allowances are higher than the current income protection allowances, and that's across the board. So the amount of the increase varies depending on whether you're talking about parents of dependent students, independent students with dependents, or independent students without dependents. But across the board, everyone has seen their IPAs go up. The state and other tax allowance is now removed from the FM formula. So that's not a factor at all anymore. And this was really the only consideration that was given for differences in regional costs of living. So there's now nothing accounting for the fact that it costs more money to live in, like, say, California versus someplace like Mississippi. And so higher income families will see that probably the increase to the IPA isn't enough of an increase to offset the loss of the state and other tax allowance. A lot of people will see that their IPA is, they still net positive. They still have a lower SAI as a result of that. But the higher income families who had very large state and other tax allowances, especially people who came from high tax states like New York, California, Massachusetts, they will see a bigger impact from the loss of that allowance than other families will. And if you've, ever had those conversations with families, I'm sure many of you have, who say, yes, I know my EFC is X, but, have you accounted for the fact that my cost of living is so high because I live in, whichever state it might be. It used to be one thing that you could say to reassure them a little bit was, well, we do account for your state and other taxes. And so now you don't have anything really to tell families that's accounted for in the FM formula that would account for their higher cost of living, unfortunately. Another change in the formula is that a student's available income, that's an interim calculation in the whole FM formula, available income from the student can be negative, which means that a student's low earnings can actually reduce the parental contribution for parents of dependent students. So you can have a lower overall SAI if the student doesn't work, or if a student works but earns less than what their income exclusion would be. And lastly, small businesses and family farms have historically been excluded from being asked about on the FAFSA and included in the FM calculation. They are now required to be reported and required to be treated just like any other asset. So it would be the net values of those assets would factor in just like the way your cash savings and checking accounts and other things are. And to that end, I know people have a lot of questions about that, maybe more so people who live in more traditional farming states, but I'm sure even in Massachusetts, people have families who either come from other states or live in Massachusetts and have farms. Lots of questions about exactly what that means, what qualifies as a family farm versus just kind of, I have some goats and chickens on my property and maybe I sell eggs by the roadside. Also, how do I value my family farm when my primary residence is there and primary residence is excluded from the calculation? So we know that the Department of Education is working on this. If you all looked at the 24-25 draft FAFSA, you probably saw that the question for just farms and businesses overall and the instructions actually matched the 23-24 FAFSA. And we pointed that out in our comments that we actually just submitted yesterday to the Department of Education. We spoke with them about it a month ago and more recently with sort of ideas about how to be more clear about this question, making sure that families know exactly how to determine whether, whatever situation you have on your land is actually a farm or if it's just sort of something, just other stuff that you have, like your car or, a boat or something like that. And then also how to value farm assets. So we know that the Department of Education is concerned about that and wants to get it right. So for those of you who are worrying about the fact that the 24-25 draft FAFSA didn't seem to really help people with family farms to figure out what to do, hopefully the next draft that'll be out like June, July, something around then, should look a little bit better and hopefully be a little bit more clear about what people should do there. I think I'm ready for the next slide. Yes. So I mentioned this before. I'm sure this is at least if you know anything about FAFSA simplification, you probably know this thing. The EFC has a new name. It's the Student Aid Index, or the SAI. That is, to me anyway, a welcome name change. The EFC often led to complicated conversations with people who thought contribution meant what you contribute or what you pay, and to tell someone actually no, it really doesn't have anything to do with that at all is sort of an odd conversation to have. So hopefully calling it an index more accurately reflects what it is, sort of a way of rank ordering whether your level of need or your financial strength versus an actual amount that your family would pay for college. The parent contribution for dependent students and the student contribution for independent students is no longer divided by the number of students enrolled in college at the same time. I know this one's a really hot topic. This is also probably something where if you didn't know other things that I talked about, you've probably heard this one. It's made its way into the more popular media, and it's something that a lot of schools are talking about. Lots of people are questioning the equity implications of that. And I just wanted to note that, you know, the impetus behind this, my understanding is, at least, is that it wasn't really about whether it's fair or unfair to treat people with 2 kids in college at the same time differently from people who have kids that are 4 or more years apart. It was about simplifying that Pell eligibility formula. To be able to base Pell eligibility on adjusted gross income and family size, you can't, once you throw number in college in, now you need the whole FM formula to be able to do it. And so the Congress wanted to move away from using the FM formula to determine Pell eligibility, to allow people to access these very simple lookup tables where they could just say, this is my family, you know, X number and AGI Y, this is how much Pell Grant I should be able to get. So it's really part of the simplification effort, and not really a reflection of, you know, not like a value judgment on, you know, how people pay for college or what it means to have 2 in college at once versus 4 or more years apart. The SAI can now go as low as negative $1,500. So whereas the EFC is set at a floor of 0, you can actually have an SAI that goes below 0 down to negative $1,500. We have confirmed with the Department of Education that does not mean, you know, if you think about that, the cost of attendance minus SAI equals your need. If you've got a negative $1,500 SAI, it should tactically mean that your need is $1,500 higher than your cost of attendance. But we have confirmed with the Department of Education that they do not interpret it that way, and that they would not allow schools to award in excess of their cost of attendance, even for students who had negative SAIs. So the way that you'll be using a negative SAI is probably more to sort of just further refine your ranking of your very neediest students. So, you know, you've always had this artificial grouping at 0. And if you've got, you know, SEOG dollars to give out, or if you've got any kind of institutional funds that are based on very high need, it's hard to distinguish between all these people who are hanging out at 0. You know, not that negative 1,500 is that different, but you should at least, you know, sort of see people spreading out between negative 1,500 and 0, and then a bunch of people hanging out at negative 1,500. So it should help to sort of better distinguish your absolutely neediest people from your very needy people, if that makes sense. And Student Aid Index still determines eligibility for campus-based aid, for student loans, institutional, state, and private aid, using that, you know, cost of attendance minus FAI equals need. It also sometimes determines Pell eligibility, but not all the time. So more on that on the next slide. The way to think about the way that Pell eligibility is going to be determined, the way I like to think about it, you can do what you want, but I'll tell you my way, and maybe it'll help you, is to think of these like 3 pathways to Pell eligibility. And so a lot of these steps that I'm going to talk about are actually happening at the same time, because it's all being done behind the scenes. Like, I think a really important thing to think about with a lot of this FAFSA simplification stuff, before I go into these pathways, is, you know, when people hear about sort of the way people are funneled through all these different pathways, like, that doesn't sound simple. It's not. But it's like, it's not simple for the Department of Education. Like, for families, it's simple, right? It's just, here's your Pell Grant. You know, they don't know all of these like machinations that are happening behind the scenes, and all of this like math and things that are happening. So now I'll talk about the very complicated process for these 3 Pell Grant pathways. So the first is an automatic maximum Pell Grant. And so families will, you know, put down their demographic information on the FAFSA. They will have already given their consent for the IRS to share their data. And so the, you know, the behind the scenes, the FAFSA processor will have a student's AGI and family size, and they'll know the marital status of the person who's leading the household. So for a dependent student, the parent; for an independent student, the student themselves. And based on that, they will look at the federal poverty guidelines for the makeup of that family, compare the adjusted gross income to federal poverty guidelines. And if your adjusted gross income is lower than some multiplier of the poverty guidelines, that gets you a maximum Pell Grant award. And so I don't remember them off the top of my head. They're like in the 175% of poverty to like 225% of poverty, I think, depending on whether you're dependent or independent, single parent or not single parent. But basically, you take the federal poverty guideline, multiply it by a certain amount, subtract out AGI. And if AGI is lower than that number, then you get a maximum Pell Grant and you get an automatic 0 SAI that's assigned automatically. So that's sort of pathway one, maximum Pell Grant eligibility determined automatically. That's the predictable, transparent thing where you could also just use a lookup table. You don't need the SAI to be calculated to figure out whether you qualify for a Pell Grant. Where it gets a little complicated is that you still will have an SAI calculated. Again, all behind the scenes, like not something that families need to worry about or know about. The reason the SAI still gets calculated is because it could be negative. So the department, or Congress wanted to give people the benefit of having a lower SAI than 0, which is automatically assigned if they qualify for that, because that could help them qualify for more campus-based aid, loans, institutional aid, whatever. So you still get an SAI calculated. If it's higher than 0, the automatic 0 stays. If it's lower than 0, it defaults to that lower number. So you have a maximum Pell Grant and SAI of 0 or less if it's calculated at that. The second pathway is for people who don't qualify for the automatic maximum Pell Grant. So your AGI was just too high. It wasn't lower than one of those federal poverty guideline multipliers. And so you go through the FM formula. So, again, behind the scenes, the same way things happen now, income, subtract out your allowances, look at assets. If you had to report them, subtract out allowances against assets, come up with all those interim values, calculate an SAI. If your SAI is within Pell Grant eligibility, which would be less than the annual maximum Pell Grant, you get a Pell Grant award. So like say the max Pell is $7,000 and your SAI is $5,000, you would get a Pell Grant for $2,000. Very similar to how things are done now. It's a little bit different. The way the wording is still capped at cost of attendance, but basically just maximum Pell award minus your SAI equals how much Pell you get. If your student aid index was higher than the maximum Pell award, so say you had a student aid index of $8,000, you would not get a Pell Grant. So now you've gone through 2 steps. You've gone through step 1, you didn't qualify for an automatic max Pell. You've gone through step 2, you don't qualify for a Pell Grant that sort of is tied to what your calculated SAI is. You get this last chance to get a Pell Grant. So you go through this automatic minimum Pell Grant formula, which is very similar to the automatic maximum Pell Grant formula, except it uses higher federal poverty guideline thresholds. So it lets you have a higher adjusted gross income. And so, if you needed to have an income of say $30,000 to qualify for the automatic max Pell, you could maybe have like an income below $45,000 and qualify for an automatic minimum Pell Grant. And so the really interesting thing here is that your SAI has already been calculated. It's its own thing. It's going to determine your eligibility for all of your other aid. But regardless of what your SAI was, if your adjusted gross income still falls below one of those federal poverty guideline multipliers, you will still get the automatic minimum Pell Grant. So you might end up seeing some weird situations where someone has an SAI of like $10,000 and they have a minimum Pell Grant, and that's why they have it. They get that automatic minimum. It's not common, but it will happen sometimes, and it will be confusing because everyone is so used to thinking of, you don't get a Pell Grant unless your EFC now or your SAI in the future is below a certain amount. That won't always be the case. There isn't this one-to-one relationship between what your calculated SAI is and what your Pell Grant is. So I know that's really confusing, and hopefully I've explained it well. And if not, we have Q&A after. Lots of miscellaneous changes. I think you guys have probably heard about a lot of these already, so I don't want to spend a lot of time, given that many of these are already effective too for 23-24, but changes to PJ, can't have a policy of denying all PJ requests. There's a new requirement to publicize the availability of professional judgment. In the cost of attendance, schools need to have food allowances that cover 3 meals a day. They need to calculate their housing allowances based on averages or medians, and need to separate out a housing allowance based on whether the student has children or doesn't have children. There's this new provisional independent student status, of course, restored Pell Grant eligibility for students enrolled in prison education programs. Pell lifetime eligibility used restoration for students who've had either a closed school discharge, they've had a loan discharge for an approved borrower defense claim or false certification. In any of those cases, your Pell Grant eligibility would be restored for the same time period that whatever loan you received was discharged. Year-round Pell Grants won't require half-time enrollment for that additional eligibility period anymore. And Pell Grant proration for less than full-time enrollment will be in direct proportion to enrollment moving forward. So that means that right now, say if you have a student in like an undergraduate student where full-time enrollment is 12 credits, if they were in 8 credits right now, they would get a half-time Pell Grant award. So they would get half of their annual eligibility. They would now get 8/12, or I guess that's 2/3 of their Pell Grant eligibility instead. So the direct proration actually helps students. It bumps up their awards a little bit if they fall in between, sort of half and 3/4 or 3/4 and full time. All right, moving on. I hope a lot of what I just covered, I'm hoping something was new so that I didn't just waste everyone's time. I hope everything wasn't new. But I did want to share now that a lot of you have been exposed to a lot of these presentations a lot already from different sources. Now that people are talking more about this stuff and you've had a chance to dig in a little bit, there are definitely places where a lot of people focus, things like the number in college, the small business and family farm thing. And then there are other provisions that have just sort of been a little bit ignored. And other areas that have been, as we've started talking about them more and more, have started to get confusing and people have started to misunderstand what they are. So I figured I would do like a little bit of kind of like myth busting in places where things have been misunderstood, and then also just sort of like, surprise, I hope you knew about this, but if you didn't, at least you know now. So the first one is the number in college question. And I totally understand this misunderstanding. The question is staying on the FAFSA. So schools and states will still have access to the information to do with it what they want. And that's permanent. That's in the law. It's not just like a one-year thing or a transitional thing. Like that list of questions from Congress, one of the questions that can be asked is how many students are enrolled in college. It just isn't going to factor into the eligibility formula. So people's eligibility won't be changed due to the number of students in college, but the question is available to schools and to states. Earnings from need-based employment is something that has historically been excluded from income to calculate the EFC. And so that's included federal work study, but also any other need-based work programs, which would include co-ops. And moving forward, that is only going to be federal work study that is excluded. So other need-based employment programs, including co-ops, will not be an income exclusion moving forward starting in 24-25. I think that's something that has just sort of gone under the radar because it's relatively minor in the grand scheme of all of the other things that are changing. I'll just add here, I think Gail alluded to this before, schools will be reporting annual work study earnings to the Department of Education. So it's actually not a question on the FAFSA anymore. Congress directed ED to find another way to collect the information. And of course, schools have this information. So they decided to ask schools. And so for 23-24, schools will be reporting just annual work study earnings. But at some point in the future, the Department of Education is actually interested in asking for a lot more information about campus-based aid. They want schools to be reporting at a student level, both annual earnings, which is necessary for the FAFSA, but also they want an institutional and federal share breakdown by student. They want a designation as to whether the job is a community service job, whether it's on campus, off campus, for profit. They want to know whether the student is impacted by a disaster designation, and they also want to collect student level SEOG awards. So this is all marked for future use, but we don't know at what point in the future. And this is an awful lot of data to be asking for when Congress told ED to ask for one thing. As Gail mentioned, MASFAA had thoughts. We commented on this, I think it was last week, and we've heard back from the department We know they got them. And so hopefully they'll be reconsidering all of that extra reporting because none of that is required by Congress. All that Congress told them to do was collect annual work study earnings data. So we're hoping that they'll shift gears on that because it could be quite a lot of burden for schools. More on little known changes having to do with qualified education benefits. So typically 529 plans, but other types of plans get grouped into this qualified education benefits category as well. When the parent of a dependent student has one of these plans right now, they report the value, the total value of that plan, regardless of who the beneficiary is. And moving forward, they will be instructed to only report the value of the 529 plan that is the beneficiary is the student who's applying to college. So if you had 3 kids, 3 529 plans, and kid number 1 was going to school this year, you would only be reporting the value of the 529 plan for kid number 1 on that kid's FAFSA. And then for each of the other kids as they go to college, you would only report the value of the 529s that are in their name. It's technically in the parent's name, but with the child designated as the beneficiary. Students who were married but are now separated will no longer be considered independent based on that alone. So right now, divorced or separated is kind of considered the same thing and can qualify you to be an independent student. But if you are divorced still, that counts as, right? Scratch that. But anyway, if you're separated, you will no longer be considered independent. So if you have a student who is only independent by nature of being separated, they could actually flip to dependent student status. There will be no more alternate months student aid index. So right now with the EFC, you have the 9-month EFC, which is sort of the standard EFC. It's the one that you see in the upper right corner, and it's the one that you use for sort of traditional academic calendars. But you might have students who are enrolled for less than 9 months or more than 9 months, and the ICER actually shows you all of these alternate months EFCs to use based on the number of months the student is enrolled. That is going away, so you won't have access to that information anymore, and you will use the 9-month EFC for any enrollment period that the student is receiving aid. Pell Grant eligibility for less, I already talked about this, less than full-time will be prorated. Estimated financial aid, also known as EFA, which will be renamed to other financial aid, so I guess OFA, will exclude emergency financial aid for expenses that are included in the cost of attendance. So that's a nice change for schools that have emergency aid programs or are thinking about adding them. One problem with them is that they get treated, emergency aid gets treated as EFA and can bump up against a student's need. And so that won't be the case anymore if the emergency financial aid is going toward cost of attendance related expenses. And lastly, the loan fees allowance in the cost of attendance will only be allowed to include federal student loan fees, no longer can include private loan fees. And in case any of you guys heard before, there was a technical amendment a couple of years ago to this because this law is so old at this point, we're still talking about implementing it. There had been, if you heard, there was like when the law was first written, it said that you had to use actual loan fees in the cost of attendance, which obviously gave a lot of people a lot of panic because that would be a really hard thing to do. You can use estimates now the way that you've always been able to do, but they cannot include private loan fees, only federal student loan fees. All right, so moving on, and I'm sorry, I don't want to steal Gail's time, so I'm going to go really quickly through these. Yeah, here we go. Department of Education. There's a lot we still don't know about FAFSA simplification, where department is working for sure toward implementation. We know the FAFSA is coming out in December. We don't know exactly when in December yet. I mentioned we saw the draft paper FAFSA. We've already commented on that. Another draft will be coming out. We've seen the department has released a roadmap of when they'll release certain resources. And of course, the department released their draft SAI guide where you can see how to do a hand calc, which is really nice. That came out last fall. They just released a bunch of supplements to that just on, I think, Friday of last week. So you can now see an EFC to SAI crosswalk, some case studies, those lookup tables where you can see who would qualify for a maximum and minimum Pell. So check those out if you haven't yet. They're actually some really good resources in there. And of course, MASFAA is working hard. Gail mentioned her participation on the Simplification Implementation Working Group. She's chairing that group. It is such a dedicated group of financial aid professionals. They have amazing ideas. They are always thinking about the next thing. They are always really adequately reflecting all of the things that the rest of you are worrying about. And they have great ideas for resources that MASFAA can develop to help you all to prepare for implementation. So we will keep working until this thing is fully implemented. So thank you to Gail and her crew for sticking it out on, I think, NASFAA's longest task force of all time. Okay, can we go to the next slide? I think Gail is actually going to cover a lot of these impacts. I'll just talk super quickly about, yeah, these are some, based on some modeling from the Urban Institute. Essentially, this is just showing us that they're estimating 68% of FAFSA filers will get a Pell Grant. Most will have a maximum Pell Grant award. These are the two columns on the far left. You'll see most students who get a Pell Grant are going to get it through that automatic maximum Pell pathway. And then right next to it, you'll see a lot of others are getting a maximum Pell because actually they calculated SAI of $0 or negative $1,500. The next most common way students will get a Pell Grant is through the automatic minimum pathway. And that's that third one. So very few students are going to get a Pell Grant the way they get it now. Very few students' Pell Grants will be based on, having an SAI and sort of subtracting out max Pell minus SAI equals students' Pell award, interestingly enough. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to get used to as we start seeing that happening. And next slide. This is just some modeling again from the Urban Institute, and it's showing how Pell eligibility is going to shift under the new formulas. And you can just kind of see here, like if you look at the blue and the yellow bars, those are the people who stand to benefit the most from additional Pell Grant eligibility. And it makes sense, basically, if you think about the way things are going, right? If your EFC is already 0, you're already getting a maximum Pell Grant. More students will get a maximum Pell Grant than they do now, but those are going to be students at the higher income ranges. And so you're seeing these middle income and slightly higher income families just edging their way into Pell Grant eligibility because the eligibility criteria have basically expanded to allow more people to get Pell Grants. You can see the pink bars here are the students who are expected to lose out on Pell Grant eligibility, either lose their Pell Award entirely or just have a decrease by $500 or more. And those are mostly like the middle and higher income dependent students. And those are very likely to be the people who have to in college right now and sort of edged their way into Pell Grant eligibility by having their EFC essentially split in half. And now that won't happen anymore, they're going to see their EFC or SAI double and just be pushed right out of Pell Grant eligibility. Just to give you some perspective on that, because you don't see numbers there. Other modeling that we've seen, I don't think it was from the same organization, I think it might have actually been from the department, said that this is about 4% of applicants would lose Pell Grants. So it's not a lot of people, but certainly the impact is significant for the people that it does impact. And so sorry for talking for so long. I am going to hand things over to Gail, who will talk about how these changes are going to play out at the institutional level.
Great. I think Jill gave us a great sort of comprehensive overview. I'm going to help emphasize and show you some examples, and we're gonna go through it. I know that there's questions about some specifics around household and parents reporting. We don't have all the answers, and we are waiting for Ed to help clarify some of that. So we won't have the specific answers for that for you today. There was, Jill, you might be able to help on the EFA question. Is that effective for 23, 24 or 24, 25? I thought that was a cost of attendance item, so I thought it was 23, 24, but am I wrong on that?
I think it's 24, 25.
Okay, 24.
While you're
25.
talking, I can dig around and.
All right, great.
Confirm.
All right, so let's dig in.
Pick up on what you said about the questions in the Q&A. There are a lot about needing clarification for students with divorced or separated parents. And so I think that's great because you will all take that back, that there's a lot more clarification needed for those type of families. So thanks.
Yeah, and we're aware of that, and we have been asking. So please don't think that we haven't been asking that. It's just that Ed is releasing things as they are able. Let's just leave it at that. So, so digging into sort of the modeling is so important. So I want to share a few things, kind of what we're seeing broadly, a little bit what we're seeing specifically. But there are limitations on the modeling tool, because in some cases there's just data that we didn't have previously. You know, I won't dwell on it, but Jill certainly touched on the fact that family farms and small business, if you've been using, you know, FM only data, you don't have that in your database. If you happen to be a school that uses profile, then maybe you do, but that it brings some limitations into the modeling tool. Exactly how what is formerly known as the simple needs test and will now be known as families exempt from asset reporting. So why not just, you know, keep changing terms as we go along. You know, we don't know exactly what that will look like as you raise the AGI cutoff to 60,000, and as you bring in the ability to exempt assets if you've got this small loss gain of less than $10,000 with Schedule C or filing a Schedule G. All right, so let's go into this next slide. This next slide is to represent a large state institution. And go ahead, Julie, advance that. Yeah. So this is just one sample institution that has used the SAI modeling tool. And the purpose here is that it helps emphasize what Jill shared with you. The blue represents the EFC range, and the orange represents the SAI range. And so what's showing on the far left of your screen is the increase from blue to orange is representing both new and increased Pell eligible students. So this is specific to Pell eligibility. On the far right of your screen is representing you know, changes in Pell eligibility at the higher end range of EFC and SAI. So it's showing you the changes, and really in the middle, it's showing you that there are increases, but not, I mean, there's not a huge change there. And I'll show you how that works out in some specific data as well, in terms of overall Pell eligibility that is probably fairly consistent across the board. So if we go to the next slide, this is also a sample large state institution. And what this represents is also on the bottom, you know, x-axis are EFCs for 22-23, and on the y-axis is the simulated student aid index. And so what it's showing you is that, you know, sort of across what you would expect to be, if both of those items were the same, sort of a straight diagonal line, the dark blue represents the families who are, you know, seeing a decrease in the student aid index as compared to their present EFC amount. And so that's where, you know, you're really seeing these student aid indexes come down, and that will increase eligibility, whether it's an increase in eligibility for Pell on the far left, or whether it's an increase in eligibility for institutional funds as you move across the chart. What you're seeing in the gray scatter plot, and that represented there, is you're seeing an increase in the student aid index because of the change and the removal of number in college. So that is the dramatic kind of separation. And what you can see clustered in the lower bottom corner is not significant difference. You can really see that separation take place as you get into the higher, what were EFCs and what will be student aid indexes. You also see a smattering of blue in the sort of the lower third and off to the right. And that basically, we believe, represents the families that will be exempt from that asset reporting and bringing down those student aid indexes without assets. So it's good to kind of see this, broadly and think about how your institution may be represented here. But I think this plot is going to be fairly consistent across schools probably. So let's go to the next slide. And so what some of the summary of that in words is that, most current Pell students really shouldn't see, they should see either no change or an increase. So for Pell eligible students, it really is a good news story. It was designed to be a good news story. It's designed to increase resources for families. So overall, there will be an increase in students qualifying for Pell. You will see more students coming to your institution with Pell. So who is processing your Pell? How is Pell being processed? What does that mean for staffing resources? What does that mean for QCing? What does that mean? Start thinking, as you probably already are, but those are some of the cascading effects. The negative impact to Pell, which are the losses, should be minimal. I'll show you how that looks in a minute. Mostly independent students are unaffected. So obviously, as the scatter plot shows, there absolutely will be some students that will be affected by number in college and also the asset exclusion. So let's keep going. So one of the things that I recommend, if you're still trying to get your head wrapped around how the changes play out both with Pell and with institutional eligibility, whether you're at a private institution or a private institution, take a look at the Brookings report that Jill co-authored with Phil Levine. Phil Levine is right here in our home state. He works for Wellesley College. He's a great advocate for financial aid administrators in the economist world. He gets what we do. His writing is reflective of supporting financial aid administrators and the complexity of financial aid. But he partnered with the Brookings Institute. They have a really good written report that I encourage you to read. But more importantly, they also have this slider calculator right in the content of the article, where you can start to play around with this slider tool that you'll see right in the middle of your screen and show what the changes look like, both in terms of Pell eligibility as you go up the income spectrum. So you can start to see, well, where does, with the SAI change, where does eligibility start to increase or decrease? And you can see it compared to no students in, the student in college, another second sibling, or two siblings in college. And you really can start to see how that impacts. So take a look at that first. And then that's when you really then want to dive into your data and really look at what is going to be the impact on your campus. So let's keep going. And Julie, just jump in when I need to stop. But we'll try to keep going. So I did want to kind of show a private landscape. That's really where things are going to be really tough in terms of institutions that have considerable, and maybe in some cases not considerable, institutional funds to give out. So this is sample data from Amherst College and some of our modeling showing just the change in Pell. So just to highlight, this is not Pell eligibility across our whole population. This is Pell eligibility as a percentage of aid eligible applicants. The bottom line here is what you see, which is probably going to be consistent, is an increase in percent of eligibility between the EFC and the SAI. The average Pell grant's going to go up. And the important thing here is that the majority of your Pell eligible students are going to see an increase of over 500. There's a smaller percentage that will have no change, and an even smaller that's a small number. And to Jill's point, Jill referenced that nationally, the projection of those who would lose Pell Grant eligibility was 4%. We're seeing 3%. That's going to vary a little bit, but it's probably not going to vary widely from institution to institution. So in our population of, we have about 1,100-ish students on financial aid. We saw an increase in Pell eligibility estimated about 95 students. So that's like 16% increase. So let's keep going. Next slide. So, in a pre-simplification landscape, there may be institutions, private institutions that had some funding that were already seeing a discrepancy between the IM need and the FM need, and maybe some institutions were flooring at the FM need. Maybe they were saying, nope, we're going to set your institutional methodology, your contribution at FM, and we're not going to go lower than that, and we're going to award based on that. But some institutions would allow the institutional methodology to go below federal methodology. And there's nothing wrong with that. As Jill said, you still need to award federal funds based on the student aid index. And so, Pell is an entitlement. Students will always get their Pell eligibility. But if you choose to go lower than FM and award your funds based on that, then they're not going to be eligible for SEOG or need-based work study or subsidized loan, but you can still award your funds on that basis if you choose to do so. And certainly schools are already using subsidized and unsubsidized and institutional loans as part of their financial aid offer. But as that need eligibility changes, you may be in a position of needing to discuss, if we choose to go lower than FM because of these changes, how are we going to incorporate loans into our aid offers? We're still waiting to hear from states as they get up to speed as well. So I can't dwell on that a whole lot right now. So let's keep going. So in terms of, as Amherst is one example of an institution where we have historically used an institutional methodology and allowed it to fall below federal methodology. We've been doing that for some time. In the past, we have sometimes we've used a compromise. We've kind of gone in the middle between the IM and FM. So if we go a couple of years back, we had about 18% of our enrolled FAFSA eligible students were awarded only institutional funds based on a higher need eligibility in comparison to the federal. In 22-23, so our current academic year, in an effort to be even more affordable and offer students more resources, we did it more consistently and we went all the way to IM. And because of a lot of the changes that have occurred in recent years with FM, we found that this year, nearly 50%, so 47% of our FAFSA eligible students were awarded institutional only aid funds. So I know that many institutions aren't going in that direction. I'm just trying to provide some, view of landscape of option and things that you can start to think about and have conversations about on your campus. So let's keep going. And there's so many trade-offs. You're going to have the good news story with your business office of increase in Pell dollars, but what do you do with that increase? Talking about what is the public expectation and impact going to be in terms of hearing that students are getting more money, and how is that going to be represented on your campus? How are you going to tell the good news story of what FAFSA simplification is going to offer to families and specifically students? How are you going to balance those eligibility swings? How are you going to balance students with more money, students with less eligibility, but you've got retention issues? So really, that's where the modeling comes in. It's so important to know who's going to be losing money, how much are you going to be able to give them back, and how are you going to, most importantly, how are you going to document your decisions? How are you going to kind of measure today what your yield modeling looks like in comparison to what it's going to look like in the coming years with FAFSA simplification? And then we'll talk about sort of the equity impact with multiple children in college. Also, Jill talked about the negative student aid index. What are you going to do with that? Do you have programs on your campus today that target high need, low income students? Can you use the negative SAI as one measure or a different measure to be able to indicate eligibility for that? So certainly, make note of your questions so that we can have some more of that discussion. And then this also will help, where you want to have these discussions will help MEFA and MASFAA to really craft and design what those are the next series will look like, next in the series. So let's jump into, nationally, Jill and Phil, they like to talk about how there are things like number in college that don't have a big impact. It's a small number of people. Same with family farms. They're, represented in small numbers nationally. And that's all great, except that you and I have to talk with one-on-one families. So we will spend 80% of our time with that 20% of the population. And that's where spending these next several months getting ready for FAFSA simplification, talking to our staffs, helping guide them through conversations, and spending time talking about these small quantity but big impact scenarios is going to be really important. So let's talk about one of those small impact or big impact, small quantity stories. I think this is an opportunity to really help families who may be disgruntled with the change in the federal policy to think about number in college. It came out, NASFAA did a survey in February, and one of the survey questions was asking people about burden of FAFSA simplification. And I found that it was interesting that less than half of the folks that responded to the NASFAA survey stated that the removal of number in college would place more burden on aid offices. And I think what that largely indicates is the segments of financial aid where there isn't going to be huge change, with community colleges, with low income folks, with state institutions maybe that, or some institutions that don't have a large amount of institutional funding. So we'll have to see how this plays out. But if you're an institution that number in college really benefits folks, then the story will be different. So as Jill pointed out, removal of number in college really helps to simplify the ability to estimate in advance what that student aid index is. And that was the impetus for removing number in college. There has been change over time in terms of verification of number in college. Some schools don't do it at all. Some schools that do it fight against schools that don't want to do it. There are delays in receiving the information. So that's not a simple process. When we used to do sibling verification, we would have large numbers of students that would be on the verge of losing their financial aid, or we couldn't disperse their aid because they didn't complete that requirement. We were calling them. It was horrible. So this is one way that maybe, that simplification can be realized. Another was the quirkiness in terms of the income protection allowance in some cases. As the family size increased with number in college, the income protection allowance actually was reduced. So it is part of simplification that removing the number in college will make the income protection allowance, that feature, go away. More important than the simplification in my mind is the equity equity piece of the balancing act here, and really thinking about the horizontal equity of families that have multiple children, and just by the sheer timing, they experience a very different perspective in the amount they're asked to contribute toward higher education. And we often talk about how an investment in college is measured and realized by financial strength over time. It's not an annual expense, except that the number in college, contradicts that. So removing that number in college helps with that, in that equity conversation, or is a piece there. We also live in a world where many institutions are offering merit funding. And so having a sibling in college and having the calculation based on that, when merit funding is a piece of the puzzle, doesn't necessarily have a direct impact. So it's possible that when you remove the number in college, even with the student aid index going up, the merit funding that a family receives may still actually meet their need. So that's where institutions really need to look at their individual students and who's impacted, and really distinguish between who's going to be left with a gap and maybe how you're going to try to address that gap from a retention standpoint. Okay, let's, I want to make sure, Julie, let's just jump to the final slide. I want to take a check with where you think we are. I know that some people may have to drop off, but also want to be able to address some questions. So Julie, guide us on how you want us to go next.
Yeah, so if you need to drop off, that's fine, and we will share the record and link to the recording and the slides tomorrow. And as we'll talk about at the end, there's going to be continuation here. This is just one in a series of trainings as we learn more. So I'll say that up front. And other than that, we do have a couple of questions and we can have a little discussion. So maybe we spend another 5 or 10 minutes if that's good with everyone on panelists, I guess is what I'm asking. So that's great.
Well, Julie, let's start. I see a question, which I think is a good one, about how the distribution of institutional funds may be affected by the negative SAI. And so I think if you're an institution that's maybe meeting a percentage of need, this gives you an opportunity to say, well, if we're going to have varying levels of percentage of need that we meet, maybe we have a higher percent of need met for families that have a negative SAI than we do for families that don't. I will tell you that of our Pell eligible students, the projection is a considerable percentage of them will be negative SAI. So in my data, I was coming up with about, I think it was 70 to 73% of my Pell eligible students had a negative SAI. So, don't, be careful, don't discount that, but know that it could be a high percentage. Which one do you want us to?
Anyone else who has something to share about that, you can put that in the Q&A, so you can report that out. There is a question about profile. If you'd like to talk about that a little bit. How will changes potentially affect the discrepant info from FAFSA profile?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I haven't given a lot of thought to that, because if the questions are for the questions that are the same, then I don't think our world changes at all. But if the questions are different, so let's take child support for a second. Child support received appears on the profile, and child support received will appear on the FAFSA, but be counted in a different way. I think if you have two different numbers there, you still have to resolve that conflicting information. Jill's giving me a funny look. I'm doing this on the fly, but I was thinking that—
No, I'm thinking how unfortunate that is. I think you're doing fine.
I think if it's discrepant, it's discrepant. It doesn't matter where it is in the formula. You still need to resolve that. So I'm not. That was not coming up for me as a big difference. That sounds like an issue that we've always had to deal with, and we will continue to manage.
I can answer this one. that says, thanks, Jill, because it's a follow-up to another one. So I'll say the initial question was, what if a family refuses to give their consent to share their federal tax information, to have that shared between the IRS and the Department of Education? And my answer on that was just, it's like a parent refusing to complete the FAFSA. So a financial aid administrator could use PJ and give them an unsub, but it would be the same thing as, unless you could do a dependency override or something like that. If it was a dependent student who didn't have any exceptional circumstances that would allow you to not use parental information, then it would just be like a parent who refused to complete the FAFSA. So the follow-up question is just, so there wouldn't be any way to enter information for them based on a tax return, and the answer is no to that, unfortunately.
And there had been a question earlier about since the dependency, whoever is, dependent on a certain tax return, since that's driving some of this, what about for non-filers? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so family size is going to be tricky. Congress, they wanted to make it this simple thing where anything they could get from the IRS they would use. And so I think that's why they changed the definition of family size to not be the departments, but to be, to not be the old one, but to be based on dependents claimed on the tax return. But that's not a super easy thing to get. And there are all sorts of, I saw other questions that have already been answered, all sorts of scenarios where families, like if parents are divorced or separated, they might like switch people who they claim every other year. People have all these very complicated arrangements with who they claim as a dependent, which doesn't always really have much to do with the makeup of the family. And so I guess Congress anticipated that, because they do have, and I couldn't find the exact language, but there's a provision in there somewhere that says basically, use what's on the tax return, but also give families an opportunity to correct the family size. And my understanding, I think, is that the Department of Education has basically taken that to be just ask people what their family size is and just use that, because whatever they say their family size is the correction from whatever came. Because of course, information that comes from IRS is masked. And so the family won't be able to correct their family size because they won't be able to see it. So I think people are just going to report their family size, and that is what's going to get used. I can take this one about the removal of the alternate EFC for different months of enrollment. Great question. Yes, students who are attending one semester will be eligible for less need-based aid. Because of course, if you'll be using if they're just there for one semester, they're enrolled for say 4 months, you'd be using a lower 4-month EFC right now. But if you had to use the 9-month EFC, it's larger and it would impact their eligibility for need-based aid. We have talked about this a lot with Congress, with members of the House Education Committee. We haven't really gotten anywhere on that yet. We continue to have those conversations, but it is a concern for sure. And you're right that it would impact need-based aid eligibility.
And do we want to talk about how financial aid offices are going to deal with the lack of having a housing plan in front of you when you're making custom attendance?
I mean, I've heard of institutions talking about other forms that they already have in play. And so Slate is schools that are using Slate. I've heard some schools talking about adding a question there that they can utilize. Some institutions have other mechanisms, and you're welcome to share them if you do. But the goal is not to really add another form. Another thing that the MASFAA survey really highlighted is that very, very few institutions are considering adding another application to address FAFSA simplification, an institutional application. And that is a good news story. There was a little bit of concern that might happen. Fortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. So I think if we can get back to the housing plans, and in the future, not for 24-25, but if in a future year it's possible for that question to come back, then that will be obviously helpful in many cases. So there's a question about, is there a way to figure out a Pell amount for 22-23, or 23-24 based on the SAI rather than the EFC. That's where I'd suggest the SAI modeling tool, because you could do that. Now, Jill, is there a version that's going to include the newest Pell amounts or just the released 22-23 Pell amounts? I know that the current version is based on 22-23.
Yeah, what we have out there is 22-23. We will update it to 23-24 when we have information, or we plan to, I guess. I can't commit to it for sure, but that's in the plan.
Great.
Gail, there's a follow-up for a link or location to the data where you mentioned that most schools are not anticipating the addition of a secondary application.
Yes, well, MASFAA News had the release of the story about the survey that was conducted in February. It's possible, though, in the story narrative of that the additional application stuff was not directly included. I think I took that from the survey data, but I think there's a link to all the survey data, though. I'm trying to remember if I had that because I'm on the working group or because I had it just going in NASFAA. Definitely check out the story on NASFAA News about the survey. And if you're interested in a little bit more, I'm sure Jill or I could hook you up with that.
Great. I see one last question, asking about what if a different person claims the child, so neither biological parent claims the child on a tax return. I guess that's one we're going to need more guidance on as well, right?
Yeah, there are so many scenarios that, it's possible that the parent who provides the most support, so who's the parent for the FAFSA, doesn't claim the child on their tax return. So the dependent child isn't in their parent's household. There's all these different permutations of this. So yeah, just more to come on that. I think the department has definitely recognized like family size is a complicated thing. And I think they're leaning heavily on just let them say what their family size is and we will use that. So yeah, more to come.
Well, I just want to thank all of you so much. And I don't know, Sean, Amy, would you like to say anything about follow-up and additional trainings that we're going to have? And thank you all for your participation too, and hearing what you're thinking is so important. So thank you for sharing that as well. So I'll ask Amy, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to thank you and Joe. This was great. And obviously there's so much more that needs to be discussed and to be clarified and figured out and all of that. One of the things that has been important to me, kind of leading MASFAA this year is trying to, engage membership more. And I know that we talk about HERF and I feel the same PTSD from that whole experience. But one of the things that was great out of that experience, always pulling the positive, was finding a group of people that we would talk back and forth and be able to kind of ask questions, a support group, if you will. And so one of the things that I wondered is within the MASFAA community, if we could help create support groups if people don't have that, because some people, their kind of shop is a little bit small. So we're for sure, our plan is to create more of these training spaces, spaces where you can ask questions, where you can get information, but perhaps you might also like to have a group that you can bounce ideas off that maybe you don't already have. And I'd love to be able to try to help facilitate that, within our membership.
And I just wanted to mention that MEFA has planned some more series of webinars and some in-person events that we're going to be having in July as well. We're going to have at least 3 morning coffee get-togethers in Massachusetts, one in Boston, one in central Massachusetts, and one in eastern Massachusetts in the middle of July. Hopefully we'll have more information from the department at that time so we can talk a little bit more about what's going on and be able to have some smaller conversations between financial aid administrators as to what's going on. And then later in the summer, we will have more webinars as more information comes out and more people have had a chance to make some plans that we can share what's going on as well at that point. More ideas of where people are once more clarification comes out about everything from the department over the next few months as they're doing their training series. We're hoping to get a lot more information and to share that as much as we can, and to provide as many forums as we can for discussion so that people can get together and talk about their plans.
Thank you, Sean. Well, thank you all. Everyone enjoy the rest of the afternoon and the long weekend coming up. And thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.